All right. All right. I think we're set. Okay. Does everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to keep this part open. Okay. I'm just going to mute a few of you as usual. It's not anything personal. Um, so it's just that you can hear only my mic, and you are always welcome. There we go. And you're always welcome to unmute yourself at any given moment. If you have a question, feel free to ask away. And I just want to begin with this, where there was once a tightrope walker, a stuntman, who stretched a tightrope over the Niagara Falls. And a crowd gathers to watch him walk across the falls. And he'll go across and then come back to the same bank of water that he began from. He turns to the crowd and he says, "How many of you believe I can walk back and forth without falling down?" They scream out, "We believe, we believe." Okay. He walks across very carefully, comes back safely in one piece. And he says, "How many of you believe I can walk on this tightrope back and forth blindfolded?" They scream, "Yeah, we believe, we believe." Right. He goes and he goes back and forth a full round trip, makes it back safely. He says, "How many of you believe I can walk back and forth on the tightrope blindfolded with the wheelbarrow?" So they said, "We believe, we believe." All right. He goes and he goes back and forth, makes it back safely. Then he comes back and he says, "How many of you believe I can go blindfolded with a wheelbarrow with someone inside of the wheelbarrow?" So, "Yeah, we believe, we believe." He goes to the guy screaming the loudest. "All right, come on in. You're first." So a lot of what we spoke about the last four lessons was a lot of the beliefs, the Jewish beliefs about heaven, hell, reincarnation, soul. There's a very large disparity between theory and practice sometimes, right? We can talk about something that is pretty abstract, pretty removed from our lives, but in theory and practice, it's a totally different beast. So today's lesson is going to focus primarily on the practice of losing a loved one. Now, thankfully, many of us did not lose a loved one, but those of us who did um, were are going are have gone through things that thankfully I have not. Thankfully, the closest that I lost, closest relative that I lost, is either an aunt, an uncle, or grandparent. Thankfully, I haven't lost anyone closer than that, and I'm very blessed. Many of you did, and it's an unimaginable pain and suffering, mourning, grieving. And today we're going to talk about the practical Torah-based guidance on how do we mourn. Now, again, obviously, this doesn't negate going to a mental health professional if it calls for it. Obviously, there are many instances where just Torah-based guidance is not going to cut it because someone gets into a really, really bad space and they need someone physically there helping them get out of wherever they may be. But today we're going to talk about the Jewish observance of mourning and grief, and as well as how do we comfort the mourner. So from both sides, from the perspective of the mourner, as well as the perspective of the comforter of the mourner. Um, so I think for starters, we're going to begin today's class with two people's experience of loss. I think it goes without saying, although we have to say it either way, is that two instances of losing a loved one can never be the same. There are people who cope with it differently. There are different scenarios and variables when someone loses a loved one. So I want to read it out loud because it's a little bit of a longer text. So I'm going to read it out loud. And I know some of you complained in the past about not being able to hear the text very clearly because you don't have it in front of you. So we're going to begin on page 170. It's text 1, page 170, or lesson 5. Again, this is two people's experiences of loss. This is from a book of a psychologist, Dr. George A. Bonanno. Frankly, I've never heard of him, but I'm assuming that what he says is pretty accurate because we're just about to read. So here we go. This is scenario 1. Heather Lindquist was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she heard a dull thud. It sounded as if it came from the hallway, and it was just a little too loud to ignore. "Boys," she yelled, "what are you up to?" There was no answer. She found her 2 boys playing quietly on the couch in the living room. They giggled. "You joker," she said with a smile. "What was that sound?" They shrugged. "Where's your father?" Without waiting for an answer, she ran toward the hallway. She cried out in fear when she found her husband John writhing on the floor. John had what was that? Oh, John had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication and it seemed to be working, but suddenly he had collapsed in the worst attack he'd ever had. Heather tried everything she could think of to save her husband's life. Then she called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. John died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Heather was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, John's death felt like the worst thing that could ever have happened to her. Heather Lindquist had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and John had been high school sweethearts. They married and purchased a small ranch-style house. They had children. They got a dog. The schools were good and the community was stable. Heather thought that the television was on more than it should be, but other than that, everything seemed in order. Then John died and she had to rethink it all. Now she was a single parent. She had to find new ways to earn money and also find extra time to be with her boys. And somehow she had to contain everyone's anguish. She found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times, but Heather found meaning and vigor and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. "I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do," Heather explained. "But I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course. We all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I love those boys so much. John would have been proud of them." Okay? A very emotional text to read. Here's the next scenario, page 172. We're at text 2, and this is much shorter. In 2004, Stephanie Moldberg of Short Hills, New Jersey, lost her son Eric, 13, to Ewing sarcoma, a bone cancer. 4 years after Eric's death, Miss Moldberg, now 48, walked around like a zombie. "I felt guilty all the time, guilty about living," she said. "I couldn't walk into the deli because Eric couldn't go there any longer. I couldn't play golf because Eric couldn't play golf. My life was a mess, and I couldn't talk to my friends about it because after a while they didn't want to hear about it. Stephanie, you need to get your life back," they'd say. But how could I? On birthdays, I'd shut the door and take the phone off the hook. Eric couldn't have any more birthdays. Why should I? Right? So I'm sure you know people or you've met people who have had similar experiences, but I want to just read a few questions for discussion. Mark, do you want to read out loud on 172, question 1?
Reacting to their perspective. If one response healthier than the other.
So is one of their responses any healthier than the other? What do you guys think?
I think maybe.
Which one? The first one?
Yeah, the first one, because
Okay.
she had her boys to take care of, and so she plugged on.
Okay,
Well, not necessarily, this was expressing that grief in
different ways.
Right, but which one is more healthy for you?
Well, if you need to grieve, it's healthy to grieve, I guess.
Right.
Yes, unless you grieve all the time.
Yeah. And question 2, Bill, you want to read?
It's not me overreacting.
Is Heather in denial? Is Stephanie overreacting? Right?
Heather's not trying to keep her life.
She's trying to just live life as it is.
Keep everything together. Personal experience with that, trying to keep everything together with people parent. There's only 24 hours in a day.
Right.
But
Right. Now, why did the two women react differently? And do you know someone who did or did not deal well with loss? Why was that person equipped or ill-equipped to cope with his or her grief? Anyone on Zoom, feel free again to unmute yourself at any time if you have something to add, something to share.
And when the guy that does my landscaping, I haven't had him for during COVID because I was doing it for myself. I had him come. We used to work with this. There was a shop living on the street. His son was 21 years old. Taking over his father's business. He died of COVID
Oh, wow.
at Christmas.
21?
His father, tried to talk to him. I could tell he was as raw currently than it was then.
Right.
Whether the care he got was appropriate or not. Because he was going through the, the medical scenario.
Right.
It's sort of questioning, why and how could
Exactly.
a 21-year-old kid, and otherwise good health.
Suddenly just dropped dead. Yep. But I think that the reason that they reacted differently is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Heather was obviously more emotionally resilient than someone like Stephanie. That's a simple answer. But also, the point I'm trying to bring out with these two cases is that no two cases are the same. Let's not forget that Heather, in scenario one, had two children to live for. We don't know if Stephanie had children. She may have been living alone. Who knows if she had support of family? We don't know that from reading that text. We just know that she was still grieving after 4 years. Every case is different. People live different lives. Why and how people passed can make a big difference. The support circle makes a huge difference. Many different factors in how it causes someone to mourn and grieve. And the reason why that's important to know is because A, we do not judge someone the way they mourn. I've heard in the past, not locally, don't worry, but I've heard from the past people saying like she's got to move on, she's got to move on. And the truth is, you can't judge. You don't know what they had or what they didn't have, how it happened, all these different factors. So what we're going to focus on the first half of today's lesson is what can a person who is experiencing this immense grief do to alleviate the pain and to reemerge into life, into day-to-day life. So today we're going to see how the Torah guides us through these difficult times that follow the death of a loved one. Again, many of these ideas that we're going to discuss today are culled already from things that we discussed in the last 4 weeks. So if you are part of the class that listened and followed the last 4 lessons, you may have an easier time understanding some of the topics discussed. But just the lesson in a nutshell is we're going to see the Torah view of mourning and grief, how one should act following a loss, how one can be comforted. We're going to discuss several general Torah principles that can help a person in distress deal with chronic grief, right? And as well as finally, what is the proper etiquette for friends and family who come to visit during Shiva or other instances of people that are grieving? How do you comfort them? So let's step back. When we're talking about mourning and consolation, is mourning an ideal? Or does it show of a lack of faith, perhaps? Is it important to mourn? Not just psychologically, but from the Jewish perspective, is it appropriate? Mourners what? Kaddish. Mourners Kaddish, it's true. So we definitely do things for mourning. There are different stages that we're going to talk about.
I think
What's
it's
it?
appropriate, even, whether you get angry at God or not, that one could arguably find some, appropriateness or inappropriateness about that. But the to me, the mourning is more about the recognition of the value that this person had in your life, and the fact that that value is now not gone, because value can endure, but that you're no longer kind of actively receiving that, and you're allowed to kind of, not just allowed to, but I think it's good to have some sadness about that, because if we didn't, it would mean like other people's lives are of no value to us and they could just go and we don't really care.
Right. So here, okay, so good point, Rebecca. Thank you for sharing. One of the famous 5th century philosophers, Socrates, he believed that death is not something that is worth mourning. Socrates was very famous for challenging traditional wisdom. This is actually something that the Israelis have innately within them, that whatever you give them, they have the chutzpah of challenging traditional way of thinking. So Socrates was definitely very, very famous for this. So much was his rebellion against traditional wisdom that he was eventually put on trial and found guilty of corrupting the minds of the youth, not believing in the gods of the state, etc. And he was sentenced to death. While he was in prison, awaiting his poison that he was going to be poisoned with, one of his disciples visited him, and this is the text that he told him to give over to his other disciples. Text 3. Bill, you want to read out loud?
Follows to immense pleading, Socrates said, and bid him be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me, if he be alive, and not terror. And that today I'm likely going to going forward with say that I must. Having the physical candidate, I would say that as far as the country, you will never take your life. Why is not
In Socrates' estimation, he believed that death is something that you should seek. A true philosopher is someone who seeks out death. Not Socrates himself, but I remember reading that other Greek philosophers believe that suicide is heroic. Heroic. That's their view. Why? Because a true philosopher believes that our bodies are really dragging us down. This is not the true us. Our true us is within us, our souls. And the way to express ourselves in the purest form would be without a body. So the body is just a problem. So as long as we can get rid of these shackles, we're good. So it was a real blessing for these types of Greek philosophers to seek out death, and therefore to mourn death, of course not. Now we know, and as you mentioned, Bill, that Judaism does believe in mourning. There are different things that we're going to talk about today of what mourners do. But if that's the case, doesn't Socrates have a point? It sounds pretty logical that when we're in this world, we're dragged down by a body. And when a person passes, it's not the end of his life, as we learned in the past. On the contrary, now they get to really experience the relationship they forged in this world, and they're truly enjoying everything that's pure and true. Why is that a problem? Why should we mourn someone? We should celebrate their life, celebrate I don't know about celebrating the death, but definitely we should celebrate. Why wouldn't Judaism agree with Socrates. What do you guys think?
Aren't we not really mourning for the person who died? The person who died is better off, right? But we're mourning, it's ourselves for experiencing the loss.
But why? Shouldn't we just celebrate that this person now is enjoying Olam Haba, the world to come of all beautiful things there?
Yeah, we're selfish. We want to be with the people. Like if you moved away to go make Aliyah, like, okay, great, I'm happy for you, but we don't have you here. So we'd be upset about that.
You're happy for them, but you're still sad that they're gone.
Yeah.
So from the philosophy perspective, many philosophers disagreed. They said, true, it may be sad, but it's not something to mourn. It's something that now you should be really happy for them. Yes, you're missing them, but it's a true philosopher. This is the ultimate dream, that they're not alive. They're not being shackled by a body. So let us start with a few Jewish texts on mourning. We have text 4a on page 174. This is a text from Nachmanides, one of the greatest commentators on the Torah and on the Talmud, Nachmanides. Text 4a, page 174. Mark Mitchell, want to read? Out loud.
The Torah does not disallow mourners to cry because there's a human nature to be moved to tears when taking leave of loved ones, even if they are still alive and merely traveling to a distant location.
Right. So Rebecca, actually, very much what you mentioned, that on the most basic level, there is a simple logic to why there's a mitzvah, not just that people do mourn. There's a mitzvah to mourn. Why? Because Torah is dealing with reality. Yes, true, we're happy for them, but when someone passes, there's a void. We're lacking that person in our lives. And Torah wants to deal with reality, and reality sets in when a person's not here anymore, and we miss them. So Torah acknowledges reality, and therefore it allows mourning and instructs us to in the proper and healthy way to mourn. Okay. Then Maimonides goes a step further. Text 4b. Mark, want to read? Correct. So here we see that Maimonides says that mourning is not just a natural reaction that Torah allows. Text 4b, he says that it's something that really is beneficial. It brings healing and comfort to those who are mourning. Text 4c, the most powerful one. This is from a commentator known as the Radvaz, lived in the 15th century, 15th and 16th century. Text 4c, Bill, want to read all that?
One of the greatest generations lost his son.
Sorry, Bill, just 1 second. So someone asked the Radvaz, you said that someone very, very great lost a child and he didn't shed a single tear. Is that something that's praiseworthy, or on the contrary, it's something to be frowned upon? So what's his answer?
Such behavior is offensive and rejection. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. That is the way of the philosophers, contending that the world is worthless, and as such, death is not a major concern about with bewailing. We who have received the Torah believe that this world is of great value for those who utilize their time
Yeah, there's more.
here.
You're like,
And behave appropriately. It is only through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears after the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable person, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and the people of good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages tell us. 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, and 30 for observing the restriction on wearing new clothing and getting haircuts, etc. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day period for this. We see that our father Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her. And we also find that Jacob, King David, and innumerable others mourn the passing of God.
Right. So here we see that the Radvaz doesn't just say it's allowed, like Nachmanides, doesn't just say like Maimonides, that it is it brings comfort to the mourner. Rather, it's a Jewish fundamental belief. It's a Jewish theological truth that mourning is a crucial part for someone who lost a loved one.
Back for a moment to the person being mourned.
Go for it.
How about the concept, particularly someone that's suffering, is, you know, they're now in a better place.
So, okay,
That's,
right. Someone who's suffering. So is your question if we should be mourning, or is your question, what does Judaism say about that? Meaning, does it change the mourning? Or saying just point me to your question.
I'm saying, the likely reaction, is that a rationalization for the mourner to feel better themselves? That, you know, they're sort of resolved from mourning as a person who's in a better place? How does one interpret that?
So if I understand your question correctly, is it any different if someone is mourning or mourning less or anything like that for someone who passes away after suffering a lot? And the simple answer to that is that every case is different, obviously. There are cases where it's less tragic. On the contrary, we're happy for them that they're not suffering as much as they were when they were alive. And yet, Torah still obligates us to mourn. Obligates. It's a mitzvah.
Rationalization to say
Correct.
it's okay because
Correct.
they're in a better place.
Torah says we have to mourn. We have to mourn. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Judaism fundamentally disagrees with the Greek philosophers because Torah believes, the Torah asserts that God created all of the lofty worlds for one reason, so that he can eventually reach the physical world, as we discussed a lot on lesson 1 and lesson 2. The physical world is the ultimate destination because, as we discussed then, doing a mitzvah can only happen when someone has a body and a soul. If it's just a soul, right, the soul's complaining, I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. But once it's here, it's like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I couldn't have done all these things when I was up in heaven, and now I can finally do them. So the ultimate goal is that a soul should be with a body. And when that doesn't happen, when someone is passing away, when someone passes away, mourning is not just a natural reaction or beneficial, according to the Torah, but it's an obligatory mitzvah. As we see in text 5, this is a quote from Maimonides, we are commanded, on page 176, we are commanded to mourn the passing next of kin. Right? So we are required to mourn the passing of a parent, a sibling, a child, and a spouse. Okay? So now that we know that Torah validates and commands us to mourn, now let us look at the process. What you wrote, sorry, let me see what you wrote. Okay, it's a very good question, Rebecca. I'm going to get to it. Okay. Let me first go through the steps of the process, and then I'll tell you how to answer that question. So let's look at the process of mourning prescribed in the Torah. So those of you who have a student book are lucky enough to see this. This is figure 5.1, page 177. There are 4 stages to mourning and grief. Stage 1 is called aninut, and onen, someone who is still waiting for their loved one to be buried. So this is from the moment of death until the body is buried. You are considered an onen. An onen is someone who, again, still does not have their loved one buried. So until the actual burial, till the funeral, or primarily till the burial, you are considered an onen. And as you see, this is the most intense phase of mourning. We don't even do any sort of comforting or anything like that for the mourners. You may not know this, but if someone is in that stage, they are not obligated to observe any mitzvahs. If you put on tefillin every day, you do not put on tefillin during that time. You're supposed to be fully busy with that process of making sure that your loved one can be taken care of respectfully, and therefore we say nothing should detract or distract from the mourner's pain and interment arrangements. Sometimes during the aninut stage, the mourners tear their outer garments as a sign of mourning. We're going to talk about the kriya, the tearing, in just a moment. That's stage one. Once the funeral concludes, for the next 7 days, it's called Shiva. Shiva literally means 7. It's a 7-day mourning period. What happens during those 7 days? People tend to go to their own home or to the home of the person who passed. They do not work. We sit on low stools, wear torn garments, and do not wear leather footwear. During Shiva, it is a mitzvah to visit the mourners and attempt to comfort them. Now, just practically, just so you know, Shiva is almost always shorter than a week, because if someone passes away and their funeral is at 3 p.m. and it finishes before the end of the day, after the funeral until sundown is already considered 1 day. And then when a person gets up from Shiva is early in the morning, the first thing in the morning. So it ends up being closer to about 5 days, usually 5, maybe 6. And not just that, we don't mourn on Shabbat. Shabbat, you don't sit Shiva. You sit until Shabbat and right after Shabbat. You don't sit on Shabbat. We don't mourn on Shabbat. Shabbat is a holy day. We don't do that. So it ends up being about 5 days or so that Shiva it's over the period of a week. Therefore, it's called Shiva. But that's stage 2. Stage 3 is something we call Shloshim, the first 30 days of mourning after getting up from Shiva and resuming the everyday routines of life. Certain mourning practices are continued until 30 days elapse from the time of burial. These include refraining from wearing new clothing, getting a haircut or shaving, and participating in festive events. So we try not to do any of these things during the first month, also as a sign of mourning. Again, this is an obligation. This is the code of Jewish law tells us there's a whole set of laws for someone who is mourning. And for the first 12 months, as we see, stage 4 is the final stage from Shloshim, or including the first 30 days, but for the first 12 months after a person passes, until their first yahrzeit. After the passing of a parent, some of the Shloshim mourning practices, such as not participating in festive events, are continued by the children until 12 months have passed. It is customary to have a candle burning in the home of the deceased during the 12-month period. Okay. So now that we know these 4 stages, and Rebecca, I didn't forget about your question. I'm going to answer that very soon.
Can you repeat that, what you just said about the candle being lit for? I didn't get all of it.
Okay. During the first year, when someone passes away, there's a custom / law, highly recommended, if you can, to always have a candle burning in your home during those 12 months.
A yahrzeit?
A yahrzeit candle, like a 7-day candle, some people do. Yahrzeit candle usually 24 hours or 24, 36, 48. There's 7-day candles you can have. Again, this is not required, but recommended that when you lose a loved one, when one loses a loved one, we should have a candle lit throughout the year in your home, if possible. Now, mitzvahs in general are holy things. They're a way of connecting to Hashem. But some mitzvahs, we're lucky enough to know the psychological benefit and the effect that it has. So even though, again, this is not what the mitzvah is, it's not the reason why we do it, but some things that we mention here do have some grieving benefits, as we'll discuss right now. So one of the first things we discussed is the kriya. If you've ever been to a Jewish funeral, you've seen it, where people that are mourning tear their clothing. an American custom became, and this is very much not recommended, if at all, try to refrain from it, but still better than nothing, is the American version became to have a black ribbon that the mourners wear, and they rip the ribbon. Now, one of the reasons for the ripping of the clothing is it's your first time that you're openly expressing and you're processing the loss. It's an opening to start allowing yourself to mourn. Up until then, you're just so busy with the funeral arrangements and getting your family there, etc. And Korea is the first time that you're supposed to. Customarily, we rip a few inches of your clothing, and we wear that type of clothing throughout the week. Throughout Shiva, it's even customary to wear clothing that has a rip on it to express our sorrow and our grief. Now, one of the reasons that we're going to talk about very soon, of why we do the Kriya is also to symbolize that it's only the outer part of a person that has passed on, which is the body, the clothing of the soul. But the soul itself remains intact. The inside, the person themselves remain intact, and therefore it's only the clothing that we're mourning, the person's body, because the soul is eternal and the soul never passes on. Now, the reason why I don't want to get stuck on this topic, but the reason why it's not recommended, if you ask me and to ask any Orthodox rabbi the same question, likely answer the same. The reason why ribbons are not the ideal way is because a ribbon doesn't have the same effect as ripping your own clothing. It's a little less personal. It's a little less meaningful, if I can say it that way. And when it's your own piece of clothing, especially if it's something that you care about, you're really starting the mourning process. And it's a very important part of it, because this is the first time that you openly, publicly mourn your loved one. So again, I'm not getting into all the different reasons and the history why the ribbon became the go-to, but I try to tell people during the funeral service when I officiate is that if possible, try to bring something that you're okay with ripping, because that's the ideal way. But again, if it's no Kriya or a ribbon, obviously a ribbon is better, but it doesn't have the same effect. So I just wanted to at least start with that process of the Kriya. Now, what happens once we understand that there's a mitzvah to mourn? We aren't meant to remain in the state of mourning. It's not the ultimate goal. We're supposed to get out of it. As we see in text 7 from the Talmud, page 179. Mark Mitchell, want to read out loud? Text 7 on 179.
Yes. Neither cry for the dead nor bemoan them. Jeremiah 22:10. Neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. What does this mean? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogies, and 30 days for the prohibition against wearing new clothing and getting haircuts. More than this, God says, you are not more compassionate than I am.
Just that you know what that means is that God himself says that he moves on at that point, and therefore we shouldn't say that we're better than God. We're going to mourn even longer. But what we see from this text is that while Torah very much compassionately values and encourages mourning as part of the process, it's also very insistent that when the proper time comes, we need to move on. The goal of mourning is not to remain in mourning. The goal of mourning is to process the loss, to allow us to move on in a healthy manner. That is the goal. If we get stuck in mourning, then it's a lose-lose situation. As we saw that woman who couldn't move on, and I personally know people who are just beside themselves still today. They're changed people, they cannot live life because they lost a loved one. Sadly, most of these people lost a child, where it's very difficult, a very young child especially, and it's extremely, extremely difficult. And who are we to blame them, right? It's a very difficult thing. But if you're looking from the Torah-based guidance, is that the goal of mourning is that we eventually move on in stages, as we saw, until the burial, from the burial till Shiva, to move on till the shloshim, from the shloshim until the yard site for the first 12 months. So there are stages of how to get out of the mourning, less and less severe as we go on. But the question is, how do we move on? How do we move on? How do you comfort? How do we find comfort and move on? So as we see, the question for discussion on page 179 is, what ideas have we learned in previous lessons that might serve as consolation to a mourner? What have you studied over the last 4 classes that you think may serve as a comfort to someone who is mourning the loss of a loved one? What do you guys think? It's important to think. Don't worry. Take your time. Okay, so Rebecca, so they're in a better place. Okay, thinking that they're in a better place is something to focus on. Okay, thank you. What else?
Reincarnation?
That's comforting.
Well, no, it wasn't to me.
Although based on what we learned, why there's reincarnation and how it works, it's definitely less disturbing and is actually very interesting. And it's very fulfilling. I think for most people, unless you truly understand why reincarnation exists, I highly doubt many of them will find it very comforting.
About the soul,
Okay, what about it?
about that the soul continues to live on and can then become, well, rehabilitated if it had some issues, and then, possibly move on and become something else.
Right. Okay, very good point. Thank you, friend. Doing a mitzvah in their memory. Thank you, Ed and Barbara. Okay, so I actually want to look at the text that we are so accustomed to saying during a Shiva that, okay, that's also very good. Sharing about the loved ones is also very important because that kind of lets the person live their legacy and share about them so that their loved ones just don't just feel like that they're gone forever. They're not forgotten. So that's another important thing. Thank you, Bonnie. The traditional text that we say at a Shiva home, if you ever looked into the text, it's a little bit of a funny text. The text is in text 8a on page 180. The text in Hebrew is Hamakom Yenachem Eschem V'soch Sha'ar Avei L'Tzion V'Yerushalayim. If you've gone to enough Shiva homes, this is a text that we say a lot, that this is a text that you say that before you leave the Shiva house, this is what you say to the mourners. Let's read it in English. It's a one-liner. Mark, want to read it aloud?
What?
Yeah.
May God console you among the other mourners.
So may God console you among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Okay. So, anyone see anything interesting about this text? So you're at a Shiva home, and this is what you say.
You're not alone, there's other mourners as well.
Yes, thank you, Pat. Now
Not
what?
alone.
Not alone?
Yeah.
There's others.
Correct. Now, it seems a little bit removed from losing a loved one, that there are mourners of people, that the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem are kind of with you. Doesn't seem very comforting to me, at least at face value.
Doesn't mean that they've experienced some of the same things that you're
Okay,
experiencing.
just saying knowing that others went through it. But if you remember what we discussed at the beginning, is that other people going through it, it doesn't help. Everyone goes through it differently.
You're right. Ed.
So other people going through it doesn't typically help. Yes, it's important to be part of a good support group. That's always important things. But knowing that others are going through it, it helps a little bit, not enough. And this is what we say.
You're right, because I remember somebody saying to me, I lost my father too.
And therefore,
Get over it.
right,
That's what basically it says.
correct. So in 1967, Ariel Sharon, you ever heard of him? One of the greatest generals in Israel's in modern Israel's history. Ariel Sharon, he ended up becoming prime minister of Israel. Sadly, his legacy was not very good, primarily because he was the one, and now we're suffering. He was the one who pushed through the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. But Ariel Sharon, all in all, definitely as a general, I don't want to get into politics, but at least militarily, Ariel Sharon was one of the most chutzpahdik generals of all time. He disobeyed commanders, not in a good way, but thankfully, I would say 9 out of 10 times, he did an unbelievable job militarily. And because of his chutzpah, we have parts of Israel thanks to him, and we staved off enemies thanks to him. So he was an unbelievable commander, a great, great commander. And after the 6 Day War, a few months later, Ariel Sharon was mourning because his son, Gore, passed away. He lost his son in 1967. And he wrote a letter to the Rebbe asking for help on how to mourn and how to grieve correctly. He was very, 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 very shaken up. He was extremely sad, as you can only imagine. And the Rebbe writes to him this letter. This is a part of the letter. Again, more of the letter, if you have a student book, I believe is in an appendix to this letter. Just I want to tell you what it is appendix C, just that you know. Anyhow, but let's read at least part of the letter that the Rebbe wrote to him after he lost his son. Again, text 8b, page 181. By the way, his son was 12 years old at the time when he passed away. So it was a big tragedy. Okay. Bill, you want to read? Text TV.
And before the Babylonians were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold, temple, physical manifestation, but not over its inner spiritual essence contained within the hearts of each and every Jew. Over this, the nations have no domination, no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, that dominates only over the physical body, concerned with the person. The soul, however, is eternal.
So, Fran, kind of on the lines of what you mentioned, is that every physical matter is destructible. Sorry, is indestructible. Sorry. It's just a matter of what form it changes into. How much more so the spiritual soul, which is immune to the forces of deterioration, the spiritual soul goes nowhere, right? Death might spell the end of our physical existence, but as we studied in the past 4 lessons, we know that our spiritual self, our soul, lives on and is eternal and is not diminished by a person's death. So when we mention the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, we're drawing a parallel, and it alludes to the following comforting thought. When we mourn the temple, Zion and Jerusalem, what are we mourning? We're not mourning the spirituality of the temple because that lives on. We're mourning the physical building, the physical space in this world that we had to go visit a temple and to become close to Hashem, to become close to God. That is what we're mourning. And that's something that we can't mimic in this world. We have to wait for Mashiach to come to see the third Beit HaMikdash, the third temple. But we're mourning something physical. But we know, and we're comforted by the fact that the spiritual existence of a temple still exists. That didn't go anywhere. We all have a temple within us. We all have a way to connect to Hashem. True, without a physical space, it's harder, but we still have a way to connect. And the same goes for when a person passes away. When the person passes away, their physical bodies are not here anymore. but it still allows us to connect to the person. We're comforted by the fact that it's just the physical part that's not here, but their spiritual essence is still around and is not diminished by the death.
Wrong memories and all sorts.
Of course.
other memories.
These are all spiritual things. So when we internalize this concept, death really doesn't sound as scary as we discussed a lot in lesson 1. And this itself has the power to comfort a mourner when you understand that it's the physical that's missing and not the spiritual. Now, I don't want to get too stuck in the next few topics, but how do we deal with someone who is stuck in this chronic grief, right? If I were to ask you one word, if you need to describe what type of painful feeling accompany the loss of a loved one, what would be the right word in your mind? One word. I can't believe I stumped too many people here. It makes no sense. What's one word that comes to mind?
Sadness.
Sadness, okay? Sad. What else?
Yes.
Injustice, okay? That's a good word. What else is there?
Hopelessness,
Hopelessness, okay?
Despair.
Despair. All important words.
depression, sadness.
Yep. Depression. Right? Okay, so let me just talk about two of the words very, very quickly. Anger and injustice. Okay, these are two important words that I feel are the most common when someone loses a loved one. And before I talk about what brings people to feel this, I think it's important to differentiate between two scenarios, right? Someone who is 90 years old and dies very peacefully in their sleep, that's scenario A. Scenario B is a 20-year-old who dies from leukemia. What's the difference?
One is suffering and one is passing peacefully.
One is suffering, one is passing peacefully, okay. What's the difference in the reactions?
There's
So
more of a sense of unfairness for the younger one, like they didn't get a chance to live a full life.
Okay. Injustice.
No, that's for the younger one,
Right.
not the older one.
Like the older one, there's no injustice, right? Or like some people say that when someone in their late age, 90s, hundreds, they pass away peacefully, it's sad, right? Of course it's sad but it's not tragic. It's not a tragedy.
But it's also justice either,
Why so?
because that person has still gone on and still has family members and friends who will suffer from it.
So you're saying that essentially when anyone passes away, that it's injustice.
To a point, yes. I mean, people always say they're in a better place. And I always say, shut up.
Right.
Because they're not connected to that person.
Right. So let me just tell you that, and Rebecca, what you said, and Bill, you mentioned, and a few of you mentioned, that in the case of the 20-year-old who dies from leukemia, most people would likely feel reactions such as injustice, anger. Why? How can God do such a thing? Right? Rabbi Yochanan, one of the great sages, lost his child. And all the great sages came to him during Shiva to try to comfort him. In the Talmud, or sorry, in the Medrash, it says, I'm going to read it very, very quickly because we don't have a lot of time. It's on page 185. Again, he was one of the leaders of world Jewry. We're actually, great timing. This is exactly the time of the Jewish history that we're holding in the crash course. Rabbi Yochanan, what we mentioned last week, where he called Vespasian the emperor, and it turns out he was able to get a wish, and he managed to convince him to keep the city of Yavne. We spoke about that in our crash course. So Rabbi Yochanan became the leader of the Jewish people at the destruction of the Second Temple. And when we see in this text that when the son of Rabbi Yochanan Mizaki passed away, his students entered to offer condolences. When Rabbi Eliezer entered and sat before him, he said, "Master, if it pleases you, I will say one thing." He said, "Speak." Rabbi Eliezer said, "Adam had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that he was consoled? For it is stated in Genesis, Adam was intimate again with his wife. You too should allow yourself to be consoled." The fact that Adam resumed his normal life is because he was consoled. Rabbi Yochanan answered, "Not only am I pained because of my own loss, now you cause me to be pained for Adam too." Rabbi Yeshua entered. If it pleases you, he basically says that Job had sons and daughters. They all died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled, etc., etc., etc. It goes on. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Not only am I pained because of my own loss, now you have caused me to be pained for Job too." Rabbi Yosei entered, and he says that he wants to console him. He says, Aaron, Moses' brother, had two illustrious sons, and they both died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled, right? So Rabbi Yochanan says, not only am I pained because of my own loss, I'm pained because of Aaron too. Anyhow, it goes to King David. Till one rabbi comes in, named Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. The last paragraph, the last few paragraphs of this text. He says, Rabbi Elazar entered. He sat down before him and said, "I would like to share a parable. Your situation can be compared to that of a man to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Every day the man would cry and shout, 'Woe is to me! When will I be able to return the deposited item undamaged and be relieved of this incredible responsibility I bear?' Master, you had a son. He read the Torah, prophets, and holy writings, and studied the mission of the laws and the ethical teachings. He passed from this world without sin. You should be consoled because you returned your deposit in perfect condition." Rabbi Yochanan responded, "Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in the most humane fashion." Right? What happened here? Rabbi Yochanan, and this is to your point, Mark, as well, a bunch of people said, "Oh, you should be comforted." Why? Because other people went through the same thing and they were comforted. Rabbi Yochanan says, "I don't care. I don't care that Aaron was able to be comforted. Adam was able to be comforted. King David was. It makes no difference. I am suffering right now. It doesn't help that they went through similar things. You can compare my suffering. It's not comparable. It's two different sufferings. I'm suffering right now. Don't try telling me that they went through it too and you'll get through it too. Thank you, but no thank you." Until he basically was told by Rabbi Elazar ben Arach this parable, where a lot of people feel that when someone passes away young doesn't have to be in their teens or 20s, it can be in their 50s and 60s too, where people don't live out their allotted time. Rabbi Elazar's message was as follows. He said, number one, life is a deposit. It's a deposit. And B, no life is considered unfulfilled. Doesn't exist. What does it mean deposit? Deposit, go ahead. I know.
On the body that God lent us.
Correct. God gave us our lives in this world as a gift. Every day that we are alive is a gift. It's a deposit. If we can give back God his deposit in the best way possible, that is the most beautiful thing you can do. Because he gave it to you, which is why, again, we don't do certain things to our bodies. He gave it to us as a deposit, and we are meant to give it back the way we got it. And if we do that, that's the most beautiful thing you can do, regardless of age. B, very important point, is that there's no such thing as being called someone who had his life cut short in Judaism. If someone died young, it's simply because their mission in this world, they either magically were able to finish it earlier than others, or they were meant to be in this world they had a 50-year period. They needed to be in this world because that was their mission. It was a 50-year mission. And when that mission was fulfilled, that's it. They give back their life as their deposit back. There is no such thing as someone who dies early in Judaism. Because as soon as your mission is done, that's when you pass away. You're put into this world for a purpose. And if you and some people's purpose are shorter than others. There's a reason why we don't know why their life was less than others, why their mission was able to be accomplished in 8 years versus 90 years. But that's the fact. Hashem gave them this soul for 8 years from the beginning, knowing that this is an 8-year person, because this boy or girl who passed away at 8 years old had a mission to fulfill for 8 years. And as soon as they finished, that's when their life is over. Same thing. Same thing.
Hmm.
Okay, I'll answer the question in a second. But if I can just say something personal, is that Leah and I, we lost Leah lost a pregnancy after about 5 or 6 months. And it's obviously a very, very hard thing. But the real question is, well, forget about 2 months. A baby that at that age and stage really had a mission. It's a very hard thing to comprehend. I think that personally, and this is on a very personal note, and I'll leave it at this, is that a lot of the time, the person's mission was what they did to others, what they were able to, how they were able to affect their surroundings, their parents, their siblings, like whatever it may be. So that's the way I took it. That for whatever reason, I don't know why, Hashem had to, put her in a position to go through those 5, 6 months, and there was an embryo for 5, 6 months, it was a fetus, and for whatever reason, at the end, that was the end. I don't know why. Again, why 5 months, not 6? Why 6, not 7? No one knows. But I'm just saying, even as far as that, there's a reason why they were there. So there's no such thing as someone being unfulfilled in life.
People that die, some children that die young, their parents develop a mission. In honor of them.
Correct. That's because they want to continue their legacy. What they were very into, they want to make sure that the legacy of that child is never forgotten and is perpetuated by their family, 100%. But it's very important that for the person who passes away, their soul was not cut short. For their soul, there was a full life, 100% a full life. It's hard for us humans to understand that, especially when it's a loved one. But that is the Torah view. Jewish view is that this person came into the world specifically for that set amount of time. I want to just conclude with one more point, is that some people feel a lot of guilt. Guilt is another common guilt. So Rebecca, I think I answered that question. Guilt is another common reaction. I personally have heard from people where they feel like, oh, if only I was able to be better to them when they were alive. If only I was able to be a better child to them. If only I was able to be a better parent to them or a better spouse. If only I didn't act so stupid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of guilt after a person passes. And obviously, why do we feel that specifically after? Because we feel like we can't do anything, right? If only they were still around, we can at least tell them how much we love them, and it was just external things that bothered us, et cetera, right? Now, based on what we studied in the past, that the soul maintains a connection with our loved ones, and we maintain a connection with our loved ones' souls. How so? Look at text 11, for example. Rabbi Aaron of Karlin tells us in page 189, I'll read this out loud. When children say Kaddish for their parents, it is like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter of Mishnah, Torah, on their behalf, it is like sending them a letter. And when they fulfill mitzvot and good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it is like sending them an entire parcel, an entire gift. We can give spiritual gifts to our loved ones. Think of it this way. What's probably the biggest, greatest pleasure a parent can have? That their children get along with each other, and the children follow in the paths that they taught them, right? When a person passes and from up high, they're able to see their children getting along, leading ethical, moral lives, following Torah and mitzvahs. What more pleasure can you cause them? Nothing. This is the most pleasurable thing you're doing for them. This is the greatest gift. So guilt, on the contrary, now is a time you can really, without getting stuck on external things, truly maintain and strengthen a relationship with a loved one. So let's not feel any of these. Let's channel, actually, not just not feel guilty, but let's actually channel those feelings of guilt into something positive. So there is more to say that I'm going to leave for next week about what to do, what is the proper etiquette in a Shiva home, but it's a little late today, so I'm going to pause here with a quick final video, and next week we're going to finish this part of a Shiva home, what we do, what we don't do in a Shiva home, and why. So here.
TorahCafe.com. When somebody passes away, when a loved one passes away, should we mourn their death or should we celebrate their lives?
Is everyone here?
Yeah, better.
I really don't think it's a question of either or. I think both are vital and important. On one hand, of course, we should celebrate their lives. We want to celebrate their
Can't
lives.
hear
We
it.
want to keep them alive in our memories, and we want to pass on their
on
ideals
now.
and values to our
Yes.
friends, to our children. I really don't think it's a question of either or. I think both are vital and important. On one hand, of course, we should celebrate their lives. We want to celebrate their lives. We want to keep them alive in our memories, and we want to pass on their ideals and values to our friends, to our children, to our students, to our loved ones. On the other hand, Judaism acknowledges the fact that there is a devastating loss that cannot be denied or ignored. When I was sitting Shiva for my late father of blessed memory, one of the visitors told me an insight that was penetrating, and most importantly, I learned how true it was. He said, when you lose a parent, a ditch opens up in your heart. He said, imagine there's a ditch in your living room, a hole, a big hole in your living room. That hole doesn't get filled up. In the beginning, you keep on walking over it, and each time you fall in. With time, you learn to walk around it. But it never goes away, you just learn to walk around it. And in many ways, it describes a very real situation. As life goes on, people learn to go around the ditch, but the ditch remains, and Judaism acknowledges it, especially as it's close to the time of the death, which is why halacha regulates very serious behavior for the first year. And people ask me, why can't I go to a wedding? Why can't I do different things? But the truth is, I find it psychologically very sensitive that Jewish law acknowledges that for the first year, you're not the same person. You could be smart and confident and courageous and optimistic, and you have to be, but you're just not the same person. The reason you're not the same person is you had a connection with somebody your whole life, and that connection is severed, at least on a physical level. And that is very real, it's very authentic, it's very raw. You know, Jewish law doesn't allow you to attend a wedding during the year of grief, and somebody says that's insensitive. I told them, no, it's very sensitive. You know why? Because if I go to your wedding during the first year, I will not be there fully. I will not celebrate your joy. You're coming to a wedding, you have to be there with your heart and soul, celebrate the other person's joy. And I'm not in that position. I have to be able to recognize that and pay tribute to it and honor the emotions of grief, of loss, of pain, and of sadness. And yet, we don't stop there. We recognize that just to stop there really, ultimately, rejects the notion that our loved one is far more than a body that we can touch and smell and feel and see and listen to, although we cherish that so much, but that their soul is eternal. They were here thousands of years before they were born because the soul is a part of God. And illness or any other cause of death can separate the body from the soul, but it can't destroy a soul. And we want to honor their life, we want to celebrate their life, and we want to honor their present status as a soul that went back to its source and continued to live on a spiritual level. So they say that the Baal Shem Tov once said that when somebody dies, there are 3 appropriate responses: to cry, to be quiet, to be silent, and to sing. To cry, we understand. It hurts. To be silent, we also understand. Sometimes pain is so deep that the most appropriate response is just silence. But why to sing? And the Baal Shem Tov said, because every human life is a melody. And when their life is finished, we continue to sing in order to ensure that their melody is not interrupted. We sing to make sure that their melody continues. And this is a very delicate and sensitive balance, because all 3 responses, of course, are legitimate and each have their place. We cry, we're silent, because the mystery ultimately is unfathomable, and it's very hard to wrap your brain around the finality of death. On the other hand, we also sing. We sing because we never want their beautiful melody to be interrupted. We sing to make sure that their presence, their dreams, their imagination, their love, their contributions will continue. And we sing to celebrate the fact that they lived a meaningful life, and they lived a deep life, and they fulfilled their mission, and the soul went back to its eternal resting place in the bosom of its Father in heaven.
So, that's it for today's lesson. We're going to continue for the final lesson of the journey of the soul next week, God willing, with proper etiquette for a Shiva home, how to properly comfort and be there from the Jewish way for someone who's going through the mourning process. And the last topic we're going to touch upon is, if death is inevitable, is there any time that we're going to be reunited with our loved ones? And is there any physical reward for the body? We spoke a lot about the reward that the soul gets after it passes away, that it gets to experience. Does the body get a reward, or is it just a spiritual reward? So we're going to talk about that as well, and that'll lead us into the resurrection of the dead. That is a fundamental Jewish belief. So God willing, next Tuesday, same time, same place. Again, thank you for joining us, and looking forward to seeing you all next week. God willing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have
Thank
a
you, Rabbi.
wonderful trip. Have a wonderful trip to
Thank you.
Florida.
Thank you.
Yes.
It'll be a quick in-out
Yes.
trip. To surprise my brother, so don't tell him. So I will be back, God willing, Thursday at midnight. So I'll be back.
Safe trip.
Rabbi, you're coming to Florida?
I'm coming to South Florida, not to the West Coast.
You're not coming to Venice?
I wish I was, trust me.
It's just a hop, skip, and a jump.
Yeah, exactly. From Miami, just 3 hours. Not too bad.
Yeah.
What's 3 hours?
Right. Well, if you come, you'll get some of their sourdough bread, right?
Uh-huh, exactly.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah, she's an artist.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I drove over there to get some loaves.
Oh,
And
really?
oh yeah, burned my hand trying to eat it in the car.
Oh,
Yeah,
lucky you.
Yeah, it was really great. But if you guys ever do come here, I hope you'll let me know.
Oh, for sure. I will definitely.
It's beautiful. How's your family? Good?
Doing great. It's doing great. I don't know if you see the sagging of my eyes, but other than that, life is great.
Yeah, I don't feel sorry for you. I've already done this.
I'm just stating the facts. No sleep.
Yes, it's a privilege. It's a beautiful, beautiful privilege. So, yeah, may you just be blessed with all goodness from your family. You guys are so special. All right, I'm hopping off, and this was really great, and we'll catch up.
Yes, looking
All
forward to
right.
seeing all of you very soon.